When it comes to conversion stories, Paul's got a doozy. It's got all the good drama. It's back before he's named Paul. He's still named Saul. And he's actually going out to kill some Christians to prove that he's right about who God is. And there's this blinding light and the voice from heaven that just stops him where he is. And I've always admired the Christians who trusted God enough to take their former persecutor into their houses while he's blind, he can't see anything. And that's the conversion we talk about today, the conversion of St. Paul. But it's only the start of Paul's conversion. He talked in our reading today from Galatians about how the encounter is so dramatic. It asks so much of him that he goes into Arabia for a while by himself to sort it out. And then he comes back to Damascus because he needs some Christian community to help him interpret what's happened. And he stays with them for a solid 3 years before he ever goes to see Chief Apostle Peter, before he ever starts to do his missionary work. And so the conversion of Paul is actually a pretty long process. And that makes a lot of sense to me because Jesus is asking him basically to change who he is and give up everything he's ever cared about. I mean, Saul is this educated, elite Jewish scholar. He knows what he's about in the world. He has got God totally figured out. He is sure of his own rightness, and he's persecuting anyone who disagrees with him. He knows he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He knows who he is. But if Jesus is who Jesus says God is, then there's a real problem for Saul. Because then he's not so sure about who God is. And then he might have to turn from his violent ways. And he might have to realize that maybe his legal scholasticism isn't as important as building relationships, isn't as important as living into the love that the gospel calls him to. And so I perfectly see why Paul has to peace out to Arabia for a while. Because that's a lot to ask of somebody. To loose your grip on your entire life, on your entire way of seeing the world, on everything that you do. And of course, we have the benefit of knowing what happens. Saul comes back to mark the big change. He becomes Paul. And he becomes sort of the greatest missionary to the Gentiles. But it's also a constant conversion and reconversion. Paul's not done. He's on a journey. And when you read his letters, many of which make up our New Testament, you can see that he's always growing in who he is in God. He doesn't have a perfect answer. He's not perfectly got his act together. He's on a journey now, being converted and reconverted again and again and again. And so there's a sense that Paul's conversion seems kind of unattainable, or maybe you've had great lights and voices. It's not in my personal experience. But the thing is, it's pretty paradigmatic, Paul's story, for how conversion always works. There's always God sort of whispering to us, speaking to us, inviting us to give up more than we want to give up. Maybe it's an entire revolution in our lifestyle like Paul, but maybe it's just that mental habit that's so much a part of us. Who would we be without it? Or maybe it's that behavior we know is not doing us any favors, but it's a crutch. And we've used it our whole lives. And for us to give it up for the sake of the gospel, how could we do that? And so conversion isn't just a one and done, from no faith to faith. It's this journey that sometimes sends us into a wilderness to figure out who we could be, what God is inviting us to grow into. It's conversion after conversion after conversion. That's what the spiritual journey really is. The more we walk with God, the more God shows us who we could be, how we could grow in love and joy and peace. We're on a journey just like Paul. They're really very similar when you take out the flashing lights and the giant voices and the blindness. We're all walking with God, invited to grow more and more in wholeness, which means letting go of those things that hold us back. But we can't really talk about the conversion of Paul without talking about what it leads Paul to do. Paul says in Philippians that, he was so glad God found him. Everything that came before, he thought it was so valuable, but it's really become like rubbish to him. And so there's a sense that Paul's conversion is for himself. And yet, it's actually for the sake of others. Paul doesn't be like, all right, now I'm converted, done, thank you, I'm over it. No, he comes back, he meets with Peter, and he's the one guy who understands that the gospel's for everybody. And he has all of these gifts to employ. And so we see him go and use all of his scholastic mind to develop some of the most incredible theology that's the basis of what we believe today. We see him create amazing sermons that call and create a venue for the Spirit to touch people's hearts. We see him marshal incredible rhetorical skills when he's in court, like our first reading today. And we see him turn all of his egocentrism outward, engaging people in incredible ways, equipping leaders for ministry in churches so that he can build them up and then leave and stay in relationship with them through visits and letters, but they're equipped to do the ministry that they've been given to do. So Paul, his conversion isn't just for him, it's for other people. And in fact, his legacy is such that we sit here today. I know there's a lot of history intervening and a lot along the way, but really, he gets it. The gospel was for people like us, for everybody. And really, we have an extra responsibility, it feels like, to Paul, because we said in the Cathedral of St. Paul, right? Kind of gives us an extra way to think about, like, what is Paul's legacy, and how is it we're living his ethos in the here and now? And you might guess, because I'm giving this sermon, that I have some thoughts about that. So, I think the first place to start is to think about Paul's conversion experience. How do we create a space in which conversion and reconversion and spiritual journey are the assumption of our life together? That we actually create a space that fosters people ourselves to encounter God. We can never force the Spirit to do anything, but we create a holding tank in which the Spirit can come. And how do we hold grace and space for one another along the journey, knowing that we're all constantly trying our best to listen for God, to find what God is, and to grow with God? How are we a community that grows together? And I think then that the communities Paul created were full of people who realized they had a bunch of gifts and a whole lot of passion, and they wanted to use them to grow the kingdom of God. And so Paul spills a bunch of ink, A, informing them that their gifts are for others, and B, how they might think about doing that in their particular contexts. And he spends a lot of time discerning people's gifts and equipping people for ministry. And I wonder how we employ the Pauline model here. That's how I like to hope that our staff understands our work here. That we're like, not that we are like Paul, but we're living into the Pauline model. That we exist to help everyone do ministry. We leverage the training and the talents to help everyone figure out how to live in love and serve their neighbor. It's not about what a dean can imagine. It's not about what a staff can do. It's about what we all do together, listening and learning, and creating a space where we're all doing ministry together. Not unlike Paul. Part of the job of a priest is to equip others that you do your job, and I can just walk out the door, right? Maybe not quite, but you get the idea. Also, I like being with you, so I wouldn't really want to leave. But I think it's worthy of asking, joking aside, how are we helping one another listen for our gifts? How are we taking the incredible gifts of this place, from music to endowment to brains and smarts and love, and employing them in the city in the year 2022? And I think, too, that's the other piece of the communities that Paul creates. They're Christ-centered, they're other-oriented, and they can't stop talking about Jesus to people. These people, they've been changed by God, and they love Jesus so much they can't stop talking about him. I wonder how we keep talking about Jesus, how we live in love. And you know they don't get it right all the time. We know this because Paul writes letters correcting them, right? They get self-focused, they get competitive, they get focused on the rules over relationships. And Paul's letters are helpful to us as a corrective lens, because you know what? We don't do it perfectly. And I wonder how we kindly take an assessment and refocus back on the gospel to be who we need to be in this time and in this place. And context being everything, and this being our annual meeting, it seemed like a good time to talk about our life together with a lens that is Pauline. I don't think it's navel-gazing, because I don't think if we're on the spiritual journey together and we're not using our gifts for others, we're not laser-focused on how we share the gospel of Jesus, we're going to miss out on the wonderful things that God is inviting us to do together in this city. It's not that God will love us less. That's not at stake. But what is at stake is kind of missing out on the excitement and joy of serving God together in the unique ways that we can do it. I find that exhilarating, actually. And I found it exhilarating even in a pandemic. That we've walked together through that, the grace and space that you've held as we figured out masks and worship and outside and microphones that didn't work. And, the list could go on for an eternity. But we cared enough about getting it right and about one another. And you held the grace and space, and I'm personally grateful for that. And inside of that, we started doing some new ministries. We feed people on Saturdays now. It's kind of under the radar, but our hospitality team is getting meals to people who have family members pass or who have surgery, and that matters. And we're not doing it to fill out our church resume. We're doing it because we just love and care about people. I can't think of anything more beautiful. And we're stepping into a new kind of way of being that I think is absolutely beautiful. And I have had the privilege of talking to a lot of you, of having coffee or tea or phone conversation and hearing your passions and being so stunned by the gifts I hear. I know I move too quickly a lot, and I'm grateful for your patience when I do something silly like sprint around the sanctuary. But never let the speed confuse you. There's nothing more I love, and there's no reason why I do this more than getting to know you and listening for where Christ is in your life and walking with you, and you walking with me, because I learn from you so much. And so I guess on this day of an annual meeting, I'm thankful for all of you. And I'm thankful for our life together, and I look forward to how we'll live it even more in 2022. May we continue to think about what Paul's legacy is, what his ethos is here, walking together our journeys, holding space for one another, loving one another, and